77th Annual Business Conference. This morning we have a very interesting speaker, Dr. Robert Holsworth, political scientist. He's going to analyze what happened and what didn't happen. He's a very talented man, and we've been privileged to hear him before, and we're just so pleased that he has agreed to come back and do this again. Dr. Holsworth is a retired political science professor of VACo University. He's written 4 books and numerous articles about politics and our culture. His comments of Virginia politics regularly appear in major and local newspapers, radio, evening news, and CBS, World News, and so on. In 1991, Dr. Holsworth received VCU's Distinguished Faculty Award, and in 1977, the Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council of Higher Education. In 2008, the Virginia Association of Secondary School Principals honored him for his contribution to public education in the Commonwealth. Dr. Holsworth received his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Please make welcome Dr. Bob Holsworth.
Thanks very much. Wander in down here.
Do your thing, sir.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and it's always great to be speaking about elections. Can I be heard back there? Is that fine? That's great. I'm going to try to give a kaleidoscope of what happened on last Tuesday, particularly at the state legislative level, talk about what it means for some of our prominent political figures in Virginia, speak about what it means for 2012, try to, again, suggest some implications for local governments as well. But I want to begin by saying it's always interesting and humbling to try to speak about what's gone on in elections. And I had, last Tuesday night, as everyone knows, the House was going to remain solidly Republican, and the whole question was whether the Senate was going to change hands from the Republicans to the Democrats. And at 10:55 on Tuesday evening, I looked at the State Board of Elections site and saw that Ed Houck was ahead by about 200 or 300 votes, with one precinct left to report in the city of Fredericksburg. I looked at the Virginia Public Access Project site that declared Houck the winner. I looked at a conservative blog called Bearing Drift, one of the more important conservative blogs, and they had closed up shop for the evening, saying that it was a great victory for Republicans in the House, but they were very disappointed in the Senate results. And I went on television at 11:05 and said that Democrats had hung on by the skin of their teeth. I got off the set at 11:14 and had a text message that said, State Board transposed a number, Houck lost on that front. So we desperately tried to recover on the television station and note that we had made a mistake on that front. But so that's how close that election was. So let me try to give the overall sense of what happened on Tuesday night. In the House, the Republicans now have the largest majority they have had in the history of Virginia. They now have 68 members of the House of Delegates. In part, they added 6 seats to a very sizable majority. In part, that came from a very skillful redistricting that the Republicans did in the House. In part, it came because the Democratic Party, particularly that part of the party connected to the House, is just totally dispirited and disorganized right now. That if you took a look at this, the Democrats had very few candidates up against the House. They couldn't recruit good candidates to run as challengers. It was on sort of the heels of 2009 and 2010, a terrible year. And so my sense is that the House of Delegates is Republican for the foreseeable future. That I think over the course of the decade, the Democrats can claw back some of those seats, but they're not going to claw back many of them. The other point that I would mention here, which is true in both the House and the Senate, is that you're essentially seeing the extinction in the state legislature of the rural Democrats. They essentially don't exist any longer. You could talk about Joe Johnson, you might talk about Linwood Lewis, but what is happening in Philip Puckett, but the reality is that almost the entirety of rural Virginia is now represented by Republicans in that front there, and it doesn't appear that that trend is changing anytime soon in the state legislature. Now the Senate was a very different story, because the Senate was the one place in Virginia where the Democrats held some power. They had a 22-18 majority. They don't hold the governorship, lieutenant governorship, the attorney generalship. All they held was the Senate. And the Republicans had been on this tremendous wave in Virginia. In fact, I would just note that politics today is often characterized by volatility and waves that go for years at a time and then switch the other way. In Virginia, from 2005 to 2008, it looked like it was a Democratic wave. Tim Kaine won in 2005 by a greater margin than Mark Warner. In 2006, Jim Webb beat George Allen. As I always say, some people said George Allen beat George Allen that year. In 2007, the Democrats took control of the Senate. And in 2008, for the first time in 44 years, Barack Obama, a Democrat, carried Virginia in the presidential race and carried Virginia by the same margin he carried the nation. So it looked to a lot of people that both nationally and in Virginia, there was this Democratic wave that was going on. It was huge, it appeared. James Carville, some of you know him, that political pundit and campaign strategist, he wrote a book in which he said, the Democrats are now the permanent governing majority in the United States. You can find that book on the remainder shelf for $1.99 right now on that front there. That is very easy to get. But the idea was that the demographics of the country had shifted. Higher percentage of the population being African American, Latino, Asian American, that these new groups and expanding groups were voting Democratic in large numbers, that they were the growing groups in the population, and we were now a Democratic country. A lot of people thought Virginia now was even a purple state with a bluish tint. And then all of a sudden it turned around in 2009 and 2010. First in Virginia, Governor Bob McDonnell, Bill Bolling, Ken Cuccinelli won in 2009, landslide elections all. 2010, the Republicans went from an 8-3 minority in the congressional delegation to a 6-5 majority. So in 2011, everyone was watching to see the Senate to see whether this wave would continue. And so what occurred is that the Democrats controlled redistricting. And the Democrats actually, for the most part, did a pretty skillful redistricting in the Senate themselves. They took their vulnerable incumbents, for the most part, and what they did was they added places that were high Democratic performance groups. So, for example, George Barker in Northern Virginia, they took his district up from Fairfax and put a couple of districts in Alexandria in it, which turned out to be very substantial, close to his margin of victory. And so the Democrats were competitive this way. They raised a ton of money as well. The Republicans raised a lot of money. And at the end of the day, what happened on Tuesday night is the Republicans took 2 seats in order to gain a tie. And with Bill Bolling as the lieutenant governor, they now claim they have an effective governing majority in the Senate. One point I want to mention, because it will be something that Jim Campbell will mention a little bit later as well. After all of that time in the Senate, all of that money, do you know how many incumbents were beaten last Tuesday night in the Senate? 2. And they were and one of the incumbents was beaten by another incumbent that got moved into the district. So essentially, there was one unchallenged incumbent who was beaten, which continues to show you that there is far more turnover at the local level than the state level. I don't know exactly why that occurs. In part, it may be the state political system through redistricting is so odd that no one even knows who their delegate or senator is sometimes. If you take a look at some of these districts, they're just very difficult to understand. People walk into the voting booth and find out they're voting for somebody that they didn't know they were voting for. And it happens all the time because of the oddness of redistricting. But very difficult to beat incumbents in the state legislature, and Republicans were able to do so. But they did so essentially by a total of 800 votes. Ed Houck got beat by a little more than 200 votes, and Roscoe Reynolds got beat by a little more than 600 votes. But that was the end of that. So what happened here the other night is that the Republicans now claim they have this governing majority because of Bill Bolling breaking the ties. They have also said they are not going to engage in power sharing in committee assignments and assignments of chairs and the like. There is some question about whether or not some Democrats will challenge with the lawsuit, but the problem the Democrats have with the challenge is that we had at one time previously this power sharing, and the Democrats went and got an opinion from A.E. Dick Howard, the law professor who wrote the Virginia Constitution, who essentially said in this opinion that the lieutenant governor has expansive powers in this situation. So it worked well when Don Beyer was the lieutenant governor for the Democrats. That opinion could come back to bite them with Bill Bolling being the lieutenant governor right now. So my sense is that the Republicans do have this governing majority. The question politically one might have is this a wave that's continuing and just going to go on through 2012, or is this a wave that's cresting and will enable the Democrats to be more competitive? And one could argue this either way. One could point to the 6 people in the House, the fact the Republicans were able to gain the majority despite the Democratic control of redistricting, so the Republicans are still on the ascent. The one cautionary note I would raise about that interpretation is, in reality, the Republicans did not do as well as they thought they were going to do in the Senate. In Northern Virginia, all the Democratic incumbents hang on. In Hampton Roads, Ralph Northam and John Miller won. In Roanoke, John Edwards won with a serious challenge from Dave Nutter. And so on a lot of these high-profile races, the Democrats not only won, but in many of these instances, they won pretty handily. So my sense is that if I'm Tim Kaine or Barack Obama, looking at those races for 2012, I look at them and say, we can really be competitive if we can generate a better turnout in 2012. That we did pretty well in the high population areas in Virginia, the places where we need to win in order to succeed, and maybe we'll be competitive. So I'll get back to that in a moment, but that's where we are right now in Virginia. A very closely divided Senate that leans red. I'm old enough to remember actually when red meant communist, not Republican. But, and a House that is clearly Republican on that front. So let me just talk a few things. What does this all mean for some of our leaders first? Let's take a look at Governor Bob McDonnell. It's a great night for Governor Bob McDonnell, a victory, another, what you might say, political notch on his belt. And my take on Governor Bob McDonnell right now is this. If If you take a look at his polls in Virginia, he's quite popular. He's very popular among Republicans. He has a 65–66% approval rating. He's very popular among independents. He's remained extremely popular among independents. And he's not unpopular among Democrats. That they're more skeptical and critical of him, but he doesn't have a woeful rating even among Democrats. Indeed, he's in the top echelon of governors nationally in ratings. And part of that is because people feel Virginia's moving in the right direction. Our public opinion polls show that people think by 2–3 to 1 margin that Virginia's moving in the right direction, but by a 4 to 1 margin they think the country's moving in the wrong direction. And so McDonnell is certainly getting a lot of plaudits and credit for what's going on. And clearly I think people believe that their local governments by and large have handled this economic crisis quite well also. So McDonnell's doing very well that way, and he's in the top there. So my sense is what's actually happening with the governor is that over the next year, he's on two paths. The first one is that he is going to be putting his budget together for the first time, and only time that he's going to be there to see it through, for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he's going to put a stamp on his priorities this year. But secondly, he is also running a silent campaign for the vice presidential nomination on the Republican side. So he has he's on these two tracks. And when I look at that vice presidential side, what I say is this. I say there's two kind of short lists on the Republican side. The one I call the celebrity short list, and the second I call the traditional profile short list. The celebrity short list is Marco Rubio, Tea Party hero, favorite in Florida, brings a huge state, gives ethnic diversity to a Republican ticket. Very appealing that way. I think Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey, a little more high-profile celebrity, loud and in-charge type of guy, blunt speaking, has a high profile. Condi Rice may be another sort of celebrity profile. However, if you start looking at the traditional profile of a vice president, someone who might be good with an energized part of the base of the party. Bob McDonnell's pretty strong conservative credentials, something the Republicans need to energize. If Mitt Romney happens to be the nominee, something they really need to energize on that front. Secondly, beyond that, he comes from a state that the Republicans need to carry if they're going to take back the presidency. They're going to need to take back some states. Certainly North Carolina, Virginia have to be very high on their target list there. Finally, McDonnell is disciplined, makes a good public impression. He's not going to make a lot of mistakes. So if you take a look at what he offers, and I'm going to get rid of this phone in a minute. If you take a look at what Bob McDonnell offers, he's on that traditional profile very much at the top of the list. It seems to me that he's in the same place Tim Kaine was in 2008. He may or may not be the nominee, but he's going to be on that list for a long time. So what does that mean as he governs in Virginia? My sense is clearly what it means that he's going to be consistent as far as he can be with the conservative principles that he's articulated to date. Secondly, I think it means that there's going to be a lot of attention on conservative fiscal management of the state this year. And I also think it means that he's going to have to pay attention to a couple of issues where he may not have spent a lot of time formulating reforms that I think will have to go forward this year. So if I take a look at where I think the McDonnell administration might be and what issues are going to be critically important, one has to be the retirement system and the unfunded liability in VRS. Because while they have made some changes for new employees, my sense is that what happened a couple of years ago when the money was borrowed from VRS to deal with the budget shortfall is a liability in Republican circles. And my sense is that there is going to have to be some way of addressing that in which the governor at the end of the day can take credit for trying to reform the retirement system, not for being somebody who has exacerbated the problems. Now, the Virginia system is not in the shape of Illinois, California, and some of these other systems, but it is a political liability, I think, out there on the governor's side that he'll have to address. So I think you're going to see that sort of dual practice going on throughout the part of 2012. And I'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes. So that's where I think Governor McDonnell is. Bill Bolling, our lieutenant governor, I think has to like this tie. On one hand, the Democrats are going to try to engineer some controversial votes that he'll have to vote on. But for the most part, Bill Bolling wants to be governor, and the issue he faces is that his profile is not high enough and large enough in the public's mind. What I've seen in polls with lieutenant governor is the people who know him like him, but 50% of Virginians don't know him. And so that profile of being the tie vote and getting the media coverage is going to be something that's very important to him. Because what you also have on the Republican side is a thought of who's going to be this nominee for Attorney General. I mean, for a governor in 2013. And Bill Bolling's there, but they also have Ken Cuccinelli. And I like to say Ken Cuccinelli was in the Tea Party before the Tea Party was invented. He is a force of nature. Extraordinarily good speaker, extraordinarily charismatic, and a hero to many Republican activists for his high-profile fights against the federal government. He won the first lawsuit against Obamacare. He is suing the EPA and excessive regulations. That Cuccinelli is an extraordinarily powerful figure in Republican activist circles. So my sense there is that that is going to be the issue, that Cuccinelli was going to do something else eventually, but what is it? Is he going to run for Attorney General again? Will he look for a cabinet post in a Republican administration? Will he run against Mark Warner, which I think is a very tough task, given that Mark Warner also has very high approval ratings, raises a ton of money, and at the end of every campaign writes himself a check for the same amount. Writes his campaign a check. He's a very tough guy to beat. So my sense is that the question is, does Ken Cuccinelli run for governor? And what does that mean? And everyone's going to be watching that as well in 2012. The other points that I want to mention here is that what can you expect out of the legislature? And I already mentioned VRS, but my sense is that what you're going to see is a Republican legislature that is really going to come in and try to be consistent with what it believes it has promised and it has advocated over the last couple of years. So my guess is that you're going to see some real efforts to reduce some of the scope of state government. I think you're going to see certain kinds of reforms become high profile that had not previously been as high profile. I think you may see more on immigration reform in the state. I see Corey Stewart here on here. I think you're going to see more in education. My guess is that you're going to see, you have the whole re-benchmarking issue about how it might hit localities. I think you're going to see an effort to try to reduce the state liability in that, maybe by changing the criteria a little bit. But I also think you're going to see a big movement out of the governor to go to this 65-35 split in education. to basically put 65% of the dollars into the classroom and 35% into administration. In part, I think that serves a very good political purpose, because if you ask everybody what they think of that idea in the public, they love it. Even though you talk to many people in the school systems, they say, well, how do you define what's 35? How do you define what's 65? And I was talking to a prominent person in the administration about this once, and they said, Bob, the bottom line of this is that it polls 89%. This is what the public wants, and this is what we're going to give them on that sense. The other issue I think that you heard that's going to impact localities as we go down the road is certainly transportation. I heard from Secretary Keynote yesterday, and what the administration has done is that it has taken a number of steps to produce more transportation dollars in the short term. So we had the VDOT audit that found some money. We had some bonding that has given some money that can be used for the next couple of years. But what you're hearing from around the state the last couple of months, is that Secretary Keynote is really sounding an alarm that says after that there's no money. That there's not enough money for maintenance, that we're going to have to find some ways of funding transportation, and I think the leitmotif there is that we may be finding some ways that are not necessarily state funding there. And my guess is that what that means is that more devolution, and particularly with some of the larger counties. My sense is that what you would see is more effort to suggest that they ought to take more care of their own roads, with some state funding released, but I think what you would find is that many of the counties never believe that the amount that would be released is actually going to cover the cost. But my sense is that that's another big ticket item that is here, and it's one that the state is going to promote shared responsibility rather than suggest that it is all up to themselves to take. So we come now to 2012 elections, and we have two huge elections coming up in 2012. The first is the Senate race between Tim Kaine and Tim Kaine and George Allen. And this is going to be a remarkable race. It has two former governors, one former senator, one head of the Democratic National Committee. My take on this race is that it's going to be influenced fairly heavily by the national race at the top of the ticket. I do not see too many voters that are going to vote for Barack Obama and then turn around and vote for George Allen. I think there will be some, perhaps, maybe some folks who, Native Americans who have supported Allen on tribal rights and support Obama. But the reality is the vast majority of people who vote for Barack Obama in Virginia are not going to turn around and vote for George Allen. Tim Kaine is hoping that there's more of a crossover. He's targeting moderate, independent women in Northern Virginia, and is thinking that maybe some of these people will vote for a Republican nominee and turn around and vote for me. And if you can already see what the Allen campaign and the Republicans are trying to do, is they're trying to ensure that that crossover doesn't occur. I don't know if any of you have heard how George Allen refers to Tim Kaine. He doesn't call him governor. He calls him Chairman Kaine, reminding people he was head of the Democratic National Committee. Not that he was the governor of Virginia, that he was the chairman defending the views of Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and everybody else. Very fascinating to see there. And so the Allen campaign is trying to ensure that people make the explicit linkage of Kaine and Obama and Kaine and Pelosi all the time. And my guess is that by the end of the time, that will probably be happening. So my sense is that this race is going to be determined in large part by what happens at the presidential level in Virginia. Now in 2008, Barack Obama carried Virginia in two ways. He energized the Democratic base to come out in huge numbers, that the people who support Democrats not only voted for Obama, but they turned out for Obama. Whereas John McCain didn't have an enthusiastic turnout among Republicans. The second thing that Obama did in 2008 is he won a majority of independents in Virginia. I believe that is going to be very difficult to duplicate in 2012. Because that is the great shift that occurred in Virginia. What's happened in our state since 2008, Republicans have become more energized. How many people here, for example, saw Tea Party activity in their localities? Some people here might have been elected because of Tea Party activity in their localities, but much more energized on the Republican side. But secondly, the independents in Virginia shifted dramatically in 2009 and 2010. They went over to the Republican side. Bob McDonnell got 70% of independents in Virginia voted for him. It happened again in the congressional elections in 2010. So Obama's going to have to claw back some of those independents. He's not going to get a majority of them, but he has to make sure that he reduces whatever loss he might have on that side if he's going to carry Virginia in 2012. But that's what the challenge for the Democrats is. The challenge for Obama is to find a way to re-energize that Democratic base and to get these independents back. How about all these young people who voted in 2008? Where will they be? Will they be with Obama, or will they be just worrying about not getting a job? What happens on that front? So those are the tasks that he faces. Tim Kaine, at least at this moment, knows who his senior partner will be. George Allen, on the other hand, what? Yeah, he's way there. He doesn't know. And the real question is, will the Republicans come up with a candidate that the Republican Party is energetic about and that they like? I've been so fascinated by these Republican debates. I think they've been the best set of debates I've ever watched. The most entertaining. For sure. But here's what I tend to think. I look at Mitt Romney and I think this guy's doing very well in these debates. He's skillful, he's quick on his feet, he doesn't get flustered very easily, he's handling himself very well, and he's moving nowhere in these polls. He's at 25% and he's staying there. He's not moving yet, and it's odd. So, and then at the same time, the Republicans are having this huge contest to find out who's the principal challenger. Who's the anti-Romney that's in the field? So they hoped, and sometimes with people who've never got in the race. Then they had Rick Perry. And this has been an astonishing performance. On that front. I saw an interview on one of these stock market shows yesterday with Warren Buffett, and they said, "What do you think of the Republican race?" And he said, "I know that it's commerce, energy and education." On that front there. But so Perry's become a fodder for the late night comedians. And Herman Cain, had this meteoric rise, stayed steady in the polls for a while, because I think there are a lot of Republicans who did not want to get pushed around by the media. But at the same point, I think that Cain's star will wane. And I think it's showing that some of these polls are now showing that it's waning, particularly among women, on that front. And so all of a sudden, the person coming up to the forefront now is Newt Gingrich on that side. And it looks more and more like it might be Romney or Gingrich, because it's only about 7 or 8 weeks before they start voting on this front. So I guess the question for the Republicans is that will they have a candidate that can run very well against Obama? What most of the polls until recently had been showing was this. It showed that if you asked people, would you like to vote for Barack Obama or the Republican candidate for president, Obama was tied or losing to the Republican candidate for president. But when you put a name on the Republican, Obama was winning. That he was running worse against a virtual Republican than a real Republican on that front. Now, some of the polls recently tend to show that Romney is really running pretty even with Obama. But whether Romney can get the energetic support of the Republicans, I don't know. And that's the task, I think, that the Republicans face. You would think this should be a very good Republican year. 9% unemployment, a lot of dispiritedness among Democrats on the wave of a couple of big Republican years, but not so great. And the other point I would mention is that the public is upset not only with Obama, but also with whom? With Congress. You might have seen their latest approval rating with 9%. I mean, it's just astonishing that could be that low on that front. So that anger at Washington, I think the president is going to be the target of most of that, but at the same time, what he's trying to do now is to deflect attention and responsibility off himself a little bit onto the Republican Party. We'll have to see if he's successful. But here's the point I want to make. Virginia is going to be a battleground state in 2012. We're going to be ground zero for the presidential race. That we have the Senate race, we have the presidential race, and we're going to receive an enormous amount of attention here. Finally, before I take some of your questions, let me just mention this. You may know that point that I sometimes call the presidential curse. That every time Virginia elects, or the country elects a Democrat for president, for governor in the next year, Virginia elects a Republican. And every time Virginia elects a Republican for president, Virginia turns around and elects a Democrat for governor the next year. So I happened to be on the dais on Friday night, last Friday night, with the Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli. And I asked him at the end of that talk, I said, you know, you've been suing the federal government over EPA and Obamacare, but when you think of this presidential curse, I said, do you really secretly have an Obama 2012 sticker in your car? I'd love to take some questions or comments if anybody has them.
Good morning and thank you. Is there any way to get the public to understand about the transfer of obligation from Richmond to the localities and make it stick? Because nobody's being held accountable for what they're doing to us.
Right. The question is whether any way to get the public to understand this transfer of obligations. Here's part of the point, I actually think. I think the localities and the school systems pay the price for being pretty successful in responding to everything that's thrown your way.
We need to stop.
That, for example, you know, there have been pretty substantial reductions, but the public is still getting a lot of services, that you find ways of providing them. You know, their kids are getting educated pretty well. There's not, the pain is not necessarily seen on that day-to-day basis by the public. So they may take it out on this issue or that issue, and they'll take it out more often on their local officials. But the reality is that Virginians still see very competent local governments, very competent school systems for the most part. So your skill in fending off and parrying what has been sent your way in some ways militates against that conversation occurring at every local level there. But the issue is, you know, how are these things going to get raised in the in the Virginia context? What's going to happen in the state legislature to try to ensure that these issues can be, you know, fully recognized by the legislators themselves on that front? And so that's the challenge that you face, the counties face, VML faces over the next 5 years, I think, is trying to ensure that you have a true partnership and not something where you're true partnership in which you contribute to the discussion and the dialogue and the framing of the issue, rather than simply be told that you're going to have a shared responsibility and here's what you're going to share. And that's the task. I think it's difficult for the public because the public doesn't always have a very nuanced view of what monies go where. You know, for example, a number of years ago, I remember I did a poll and we just asked the public what was the largest source of income in the state. 25% thought it was the lottery on that front. But that's the kind of thing you face. And as I said, my sense is that what Virginians have seen over the last few years, that Virginia is a little better off than most of the nation in terms of our unemployment rate and the like. But what they've seen is very competent local governments and local school systems deal with a pretty onerous budgetary situation in ways that by and large they're still pretty comfortable with. And that's the task that your organizations and you face in working with the state.
Yes, Tom,
yeah.
You mentioned that you see in the legislature, the upcoming legislature, one of the efforts to change the ratio to 65-35 in education.
Yes.
And I guess I'm a little confused about that ratio. I think the ratio right now, and I don't know how this mix is, but what you're calling administration, I know right now is 80% of educational costs are personnel costs. But are you saying that the effort will be to make 65%, change that 80% to 35%, or administration is more?
No, personnel costs would be both instruction and administration. Okay. What's happening is that there's a discussion about how to segregate those costs. What should be the formula by which you say this is an instructional cost or this is an administrative cost? And that's not an easy discussion. But there is some formula out there that the administration would prefer to use. Most of the education groups would prefer other kinds of formulas, because what this will mean is that if you ask the public where your money should go in education, where do they say? The classroom. Put the money in the classroom. Put the money in teachers. Put the money there. And don't put it in administration. And what you would see is that people would argue, who take this position very strongly, that if you looked at the personnel in the educational systems over 20 years, what you see are far more people doing what? Administration. Say if you looked at universities, to put them in the mix too, though they're not, you would really see that. You would see a lot of people far more there. Now, is those people supporting instruction? Are they there because of compliance issues? What are they there for? But that's what it is. It's not a personnel issue per se. It's for asking all the locals to be able to segregate their costs and to show that over whatever period of time it would be, 2 years or 3 years or 1 year, that they are putting 65% of their money in instruction. So what it essentially does is ask for reprioritization without necessarily having to put in what? Additional dollars.
Any idea what the present, what would you guess would be?
Oh, the present one it's not that far away. It's around 62% from what I gather, and I would presume, depending upon the locality, it could be lower or higher. So it may not affect every locality otherwise, but if you're talking about some of these mega million, school budgets, 3% moving one way or the other way is substantial dollars, particularly if some of the other costs are associated with paying off building obligations and those kind of matters. Yes, there's another.
Yes.
Could you stand up so everyone can just even hear me?
I'm assuming from what you said that we're going to expect to have less money coming from the state government for at least the next 5 years. And if that's the case, will the state government give us any or allow us to use any new taxes to try to recover some of the loss. Real estate taxes and personal property taxes seem to only go so far. And I was wondering if you could comment
What
on
new
that.
taxes are you thinking of?
Well, in our case, I'm thinking about maybe a food tax that the town has that we don't have in the county unless you have an election.
Okay, good point. Meals tax of some... Right. Okay, let me try to say, first, 5 years is a tough projection because typically how much money the state spends depends on how much money the state brings in. But from what I gather, you heard from Rick Brown yesterday, and what's so interesting about this is that there's this little bit of schizophrenia that happens right now. Every month I get a press release saying the state budget is better than it was. You know, that the revenues have increased and we're above budget and all of that. But every time we hear a presentation about what's going to happen next year, it's, you know, gloom, doom, and worse. And perhaps because some source of the money that the state's getting was not going to repeat itself, whether the reduction in federal aid, Virginia, I think, is second in the per capita in terms of the benefit from federal spending in the country. We hate the federal government, but we like that spending there. And then secondly, stimulus dollars leaving is likely to put another hole in some of the budgetary situations. So those kind of things clearly are going to be happening for the next couple of years. This next budget that's going to be presented, I think, is going to be a very frugal budget that way. My sense is that the way you frame the issue is exactly the way that localities have to frame the issue. Is that what you said is that you're not really asking for new taxes, you're asking for what? Level playing field among all localities on that side. So that to me is an argument that legislators might like more so than, you know, new taxes. And some of the new taxes, they would say, well, you know, don't some of the localities have the opportunity to do even local income taxes, and they won't do them anyway because of the political ramifications there. So my sense is that the way to think this through is to think about having a relatively level playing field that gives the localities the capacity to do what the citizens want them to do. And I think that needs to be part of the discussion and argument that goes forward from the localities. But I would emphasize that I think almost more than at any time that I can imagine in recent history, it is going to be critically important for people like Jim and Mike Amix and others to be explaining these issues up there, particularly because even in the House there are a lot of new people that came in with redistricting. So some ways of ensuring that that connection, not just during the legislative session, but during the entire year, that you work in your localities, because you can't put it all on Jim and you know, VML and whatever, but that you're working in those localities to build those relationships with your legislative delegations to ensure that they understand that when they come to Richmond, they know what these situations are, and they're not hearing from you for the first time when some bill comes up in January and February. I think it's more incumbent than ever to try to build partnerships year-round with your delegation. Some places already do that very well, but it's, I think, going to be incumbent on everyone in local government to work on that in order to get that level playing field that you need in order to meet what your citizens expect. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. There's yes. And
Sorry. Quick question. I think there's sort of general acknowledgement by lots of people, not just local officials, that some type of tax reform, state tax reform, is probably needed. Several years ago, Mark Warner managed to make some changes in the tax code. The bottom line is, even if you look at the state constitution, the state is not really living up to its responsibilities in funding core services because they actually need more revenue coming in. what are the prospects of some kind of tax reform package ever passing?
You know, that's a very good question. There is some belief. The Jefferson Institute, Mike Thompson, believes that in fact they may put one forward this year that could have a good opportunity of passing. I tend to think that that's, I could be wrong. I tend to think that that's a cell that has yet to be put, you know, is yet to be won, or yet to be, in some ways, even established. I think it's going to be very difficult to get a major tax reform passed unless you establish the groundwork for that over a period of time. And so maybe that's another place where that can be sort of a discussion promoted, you know, commissions, high-profile commissions, and then you have to have champions to make it happen, or else it becomes a reform that just never occurs. And I'll give you an example of one that doesn't occur. I chaired this year the Governor's Independent Bipartisan Commission on Redistricting, in which we were told to go around the state, hear what citizens wanted to say about redistricting, produce a report that would keep jurisdictions together, that wouldn't split up precincts, and we did all of that. We spent 3 months of our lives, going around the state. We argued about this report. We produced metrics that could show, for the first time, how many districts were actually split, how many jurisdictions were there. We produced measures of compactness of districts. We got almost every editorial page in the state to endorse what we had done. We handed it to the legislators. They said, "Thank you very much," and ignored every word of it. So that's the issue, is that what I think is needed is a champion. And that champion has to be somebody who's running for office, who really is willing to make this part of an election. Beyond that, I think there will be proposals starting this year. I hope you're right that, you know, most people would see the wisdom of doing that, but I tend to think that it's going to be very tough to come and pass some kind of wide-ranging tax reform that's going to redo the Virginia tax system overnight.
Yeah, right.
That's my take. Yes?
Related question. Any opportunity for some relaxation of the Dillon rule? And I'm thinking particularly in a locality that has seasonal residents, for example, that might have, for revenue's sake, at some point down the road, raise real estate taxes a little bit, but maybe has a homestead exemption for primary residents, so that the tax increase is felt a little bit more by the seasonal residents. Right now, we don't have the ability to do that.
Okay, that's a good question. Relaxation of the Dillon rule. I tend to think it's going to be difficult to get what I would call a wholesale relaxation of the Dillon rule, largely because one of the arguments against it is typically the need to have some type of uniformity in the
devolution of roads.
So, but that's the dilemma they have of not relaxing the Dillon rule. So my sense is that you're more likely to get still these individual waivers than you are likely to get a wholesale change to home rule in Virginia. I just don't see that coming at the moment. And part of it is that there's a significant part of the business community has never been interested in having potentially 42 different regulations depending upon localities. And that's the dilemma. So if you're going to get relaxation of the Dillon rule, it seems to me you'd have to do it not in an adversarial relationship, but in a partnership or collaborative relationship in which you got the business communities, big groups like the Chamber on board with which to begin. And that could happen. I mean, I think those are very reasonable people. Yes?
regarding taxes, there's again, I think, going to be another effort to reform local taxation in the area of BPOL and versus capital and machine tool taxes and those sort of things. Do you think we stand a good chance of fighting that back yet again because of the current economic situation, saying, look, if you're not willing to reform the whole tax code, then let's just leave taxes alone and hold us harmless at local level? What kind of a fight do you think we may have there, and what kind of chance do you think we have of being successful in that fight?
Well, I think, as you said, I think that's probably the strongest argument you have. And again, but that's an argument that's going to depend on your success in the next few months. That it seems to me that you're going to have a lot of delegates who are going to go talk about this, and it seems that you really have to have this in place as you go forward, that they have to know before they get to Richmond, that their localities are very, very concerned about their capacity to raise revenue, and that sources are taken away or adjusted in ways that reduce the revenues you can get, something has to be done. And again, this raises the importance of thinking about overall this wholesale effort to change it, because there's good reason to think about a 21st century tax code that doesn't look like a late 19th century tax code. So the arguments for these adjustments never are bad arguments, but taken one by one, they have the potential of just harming localities, and I think you have to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that again is dependent in part on your success prior to this session in talking to your legislators, so they know what these issues are and know what the impact is by the time they set foot at the General Assembly in January. Yes, there's another?
Yes, you mentioned earlier that the subject of immigration might be one that the General Assembly might take up. I wonder, with Virginia already having some of the most punitive laws in the books already on immigration, and with the result of Alabama and the collapse of their agriculture industry there, was a show on NBC last night actually about that and the difficulties and devices that causes. And having had the candidates from the legislature this year campaign on the economy, jobs, transportation, why would they want to then turn to social issues? And what's there to gain for Republican legislature on this divisive issue?
Okay, it's very...
And another thing, that Virginia is already known as a business-friendly state in which, we're always ranked very highly on attracting businesses. Why would we want to send a message that we don't want to attract folks to the state?
Okay, that's a superb question. So let me try to get. I'm going to address first of all the social issues, and then I'm going to try to address immigration. First, there are a set of delegates who were elected very much on the pledge to address some of these social issues. They were very big parts of their campaign. If you saw, for example, the last weeks of the campaign of Bryce Reeves against Ed Howard, much of that was on abortion. And much of the television and radio ads were on abortion. Secondly, there are many people who are going to go to the Assembly in January who believe that there is this pent-up demand on some of these social issues. Their perception is that the House passed them and the Senate blocked them. And now with the Senate in Republican hands, particularly some of the committees that are important here, these can be unblocked, so there can be a pent-up demand. So there you have legislators who have put in some legislation year after year, some of which is passed, much of which has passed the House, very little of which has passed the Senate, who now think that that this should be done on that front. So, and my take on this is that this is going to be part of it. The other point I would mention about the social issues, the media love them. Because they're issues that the public can easily understand in some ways as well. So they are covered extraordinarily highly by the media. That regardless, the state budget, very tough to understand. Regulating abortion clinics as hospitals, easy. Something that came up last year. So that's why I think you're going to continue to see this. And you're going to continue to see some of the legislation, mostly but not entirely, out of some of the Northern Virginia-led delegation on immigration, particularly having to do with how law enforcement acts and the like. I think you're going to see more of that come forward. Now, you do raise a very interesting point, though. This is one issue where the business community's conservatism is not always the same as social conservatism, because they often have an interest in ensuring that they're going to have adequate supplies of workers. So my sense is you're going to find some compromises on things like E-Verify and the like, but what you're not going to see is the business community just supporting any and all legislation that comes down that road. But again, my take on this is that you have people who have been in the legislature proposing this for years, who believe that it has been blocked by the Senate, now see that opportunity to have it unblocked, and that's what they're going to propose. And they got elected. Again, I mean, that's part of what they're going to tell you. They were re-elected, and their position on this is going to be clear, and they're going to bring it forward. Where we're going to be at the end of the day on that it is going to be an interesting question. And what it also has to do is it has to do with political judgments that the governor and others are going to make about where the new ethnic communities are going to be politically. And so that's what, and I think we're going to see more and more of that as we go forward. Yes?
You mentioned level playing field a few moments ago. Would you give us your take on why the state continues to insist on an unlevel playing field with regard to the county's rights to enact certain legislation, including the meals tax, and wants to hold that out so that they continue to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I don't have a very good answer to that, other than I think some people don't like to be associated in some instances with endorsing higher taxes. But again, my take on that is that there's a way to address that really is this level playing field argument, and is probably the best way of addressing it. There is some reluctance on that. I remember when Governor Allen campaigned for governor the first time, there was a newspaper story where they were talking about where they were going to eat that evening, his campaign staff, and Governor Allen said, well, I'm not eating the city of Richmond. I got 11% meals tax, or something like that. I'm going elsewhere. Let's go to Chesterfield. Let's go to, let's go to Henrico. Let's go to some other place where the tax isn't so high. So I think there's also this question that these taxes can get out of hand, that they can go high, and so no one wants to be associated with putting that higher tax in. But again, it would appear to me that the counter-argument is very much the level playing field argument, and that over time that has the possibility of succeeding. Yes, there's Marlene.
Yeah, good to see you. You talk about partnerships and collaboration, great concepts. But I think yesterday, when we had some discussions on transportation, once again, it was an example of there really isn't a true partnership. We left the room feeling, what are we going to do as local governments? To be able to have strong partnerships and collaboration, there needs to be communication. And when we tried to get some understanding about the options available to us, particularly with devolution, we weren't given it. So we couldn't even get to first base. And I guess I would like you to comment on what we can do collectively, local governments, administrations, on this transportation issue. It's something that's been bouncing back and forth in the state of Virginia for the last 15 years. So this is not a new concept where monies would be taken out of construction to be able to pay for maintenance. And at the end of the day, everybody admits there's just no money. How do we position ourselves and not wait till February when we go down to General Assembly, when there's an unlevel playing field? We know that the legislators do not get the tough questions that we do at the local level. They're sort of an upper hand and they know it. So what can we do to be able to position ourselves come December, January, February to push back
on our state to be able to do something about this transportation issue, because we can't afford, I don't believe, to bounce this tennis ball back and forth for the next 10 to 15 years.
Okay, thanks. Great question. It would seem to me, and I'm not a political strategist, but it is a political strategy that you're talking about, and it would seem to me the question then is, who are your partners in this fight? Who are the people who are the big stakeholders in the transportation issue? And and if you're not getting a great reception from one of the more important partners, the state government, how do you work with the other people who are interested? How do you work with the chambers? How do you work with the statewide business community? How do you then find ways to ensure that local government perspective is developing partnerships with the appropriate stakeholders? Now, one of the things that I would recall, to go back to 1994, when you were talking about Mark Warner and the tax package and tax reform there, is I recall there was a very extensive group of people who got together and supported that. That it won and it received Republican support, those 16 Republicans who may dread the day they voted for that, but the reality is that there was an enormous effort to bring stakeholders together that went beyond the normal partnerships. And that, to me, seems to be the best hope that local governments would also have on transportation, is making your own perspective very clear with the legislators, but also having the kind of conversations that you would have with the people who are really pushing the need for better infrastructure investment in Virginia, which tends to be a significant part of the business community, and talking with them so that you're on the same page, or at least share some similar points of view as this issue is pressed forward. So if you're having trouble, seems to me the only, you either do what you're doing better, or you expand that range of partners and collaborations that you have to ensure that your point of view is part of that larger argument. That's the only, clearest sense that I would have right now, is to think about, again, that 1994 situation, some of these counter-type collaborations that could go on that ensure that your perspective is aligned or at least incorporated in some of the other people who are very instrumental in that discussion.
Obviously, 1994 versus where we are today, it's an entirely different environment. So, I guess what I'm trying to, we can all go to our chambers and our businesses, but I really think we need leadership from the state. And we've shown leadership. We've shown leadership at the local level. We're dealing with tough budgets. We're reaching out to the different counterparts. Where's the leadership of the state to be able to help move us forward?
Well, I think you've seen where the state is right now, okay? So we've seen the first 2 years of what's happened. It's been an effort to put more money more quickly into some projects that are on the books. We secondly have a major effort going on to toll on I-95. Thirdly, we have an effort to build some roads through public-private partnerships that would include some tolls as well. I can think of 460, the expansion of 460 that's being spoken about. So the question is, where are we going on the next steps? And again, that seems to be part of the political process, and that's not going to be handled simply by this administration. That's going to be part of the next administration, and that seems to me that what has to happen there, if it's going to change, is it needs to be part of an election. Because elections, in my mind, matter. People raise issues, and if they get mandates, then everybody listens to what happened. So that seems to me to be part of this issue, that it's an issue that's gone on for decades now, right? That in Virginia. When we talk about 1994 or 2004, one of the things I would mention there is that what was not part of that bargain at all? Transportation. It had nothing to do with 2004, essentially. So we've been debating this issue Now it'll be 15, 20 years and have made very little progress. It's time to find for, some folks who are going to come up with creative ideas and willing to put them forward. One more question, one final question.
I wanted to bring it almost back to where we started with this. And you addressed the tax reform issue in a way, but I wonder if where we are today is so further from where we attempted years ago to address tax reform in the context of Virginia being one of the wealthier states in the nation, but Virginia having disproportionately the larger portion of those who are in need because of how that service is delivered now locally, such that there is a total divulsion of all services, but leaves the localities with the total inability to do what some of us, such as the wealthiest county in the Commonwealth, can subsidize that with other taxes. And this disproportionality affects us in every way. It isn't just the transportation, it's the education, the human services, all of those services. And we become a totally different Commonwealth. And what is the context we deliver that message that disproportionately we have people living in our Commonwealth differently economically with opportunity because the state does not carry its responsibility?
Okay, that's a very tough argument, but let me try to answer that question. It's a wonderful question to end on because it stumps me in so many ways. But the point that you raised, the first point you raised, is that by and large, Virginia ranks pretty high among states with per capita income. I think we're always somewhere, around the top 10. And if you actually took it, our overall standard of living, compared to some of the states that rank higher, we're pretty well off. It looks to me like we're almost like a top 5 state in that front. Because we're not, it's not like trying to live in Connecticut for most people and things like that. So my sense is that we rank very high, but what you point to is that in some of our social service categories, typically, when you take a look at where Virginia ranks, it probably ranks from 40 down on that front. And that's, again, something that has been going on for quite some time. And we find it in, let us say, Medicaid spending, where it's taking up an enormous amount of the state budget, 21%, but we still rank fairly low in terms of the services that the overall state provides on that front. So whether or not this kind of inequality is going to have a political implication is not something that we've seen so far at the state level, but it certainly affects local governments on that front. And so my sense about this is that this is once again a place where local government has to work over time to try to see what it can do to convince state legislators that this is something that ought to be a very high priority for them. It typically is the higher priority in education, because I think everyone understands education as a potential motor for opportunity and can understand the need to try to find a way to ensure that all our citizens are educated. But in the traditional social service area, Virginia lags, and that is one area where I don't exactly have a good answer for you, other than to say that over time, this seems to be the responsibility of trying to find a way to convince your legislators that certain adjustments need to be made. Sometimes these adjustments are made when you find a crisis area, such as the Virginia Tech killings and what that massacre did to have people think about some mental health services. But my take on this right now is that you've just put your finger on a large problem, but it's not just a Virginia problem. If you take a look at what people are looking at in terms of economic equality in the United States, it's become a growing American problem. And I wish I had the answer, but I don't. But on that sad note, let me thank you very much.